It would be fair to say that the so-called Western world is tonight in a state of chaos. The German government has already effectively fallen. The little soldier Schultz, Anna Baerbock coalition government has no longer got the third of its traffic lights in its so-called traffic light coalition. It's now just so-called red and green. The middle letter has already left. But the two of them together can now muster barely 15% in the national opinion polls. Together, and the closure of landmark German industrial plant has created a state of economic and political chaos in the country, with every possibility that the party they were trying to ban, the AfD, coming to power, at least in part of an unusual coalition indeed. But mainly the focus this evening is on the French government, which is either going to fall and the president is going to ignore the vote of no confidence in the Tailor's dummy Michel Barnier, or it's going to scrape through. We'll know that in the next couple of minutes. But Barnier is only the Prime Minister because Macron refused to recognize the result of the election he called a year early, in the hope of using the fear of Marine Le Pen to shoehorn a majority for what he calls the centre-left, though not many of the rest of us would so describe it. But he failed miserably, and his party came third in those elections, but he still nominated one of his party to be the Prime Minister. The government has lasted barely 40 days. The Liz Truss Curse has been visited on Michel Barnier. And if it falls tonight, well, Macron says he'll ignore it and nominate another of his party members. This is the free world, ladies and gentlemen. This is democracy that we grew up being told was the unique selling point of NATO, later of the EU, and of the wildly geographically inaccurate term, the Western world, which is a segue into South Korea. Well, I think that the fly you'd like to have been on any wall in the Korean peninsula the other night was the wall of the North Korean leader, Kim Jong-un. Can you imagine the mirth in Pyongyang as a military coup in 2024 was launched by the president of South Korea, who declared martial law and ordered the armed forces to break their way into the South Korean parliament, which they duly did, now causing the resignation of South Korea's Minister of Defense, who is taking full responsibility for the fiasco. After a lot of handbags, push me, pull you, fracas inside the South Korean parliament, it became clear that the martial law was not going to last, and so it turned out. And right now, the main government party and the opposition party are combining to impeach the South Korean president and throw him out of office. But there's hundreds of thousands of people on the streets. There's a general strike in South Korea. And the demand of the people is not impeachment. It's not even resignation, but it's the prosecution and jailing of a South Korean president unusually close, can I put it that way, to Joe Biden and Antony Blinken. Just in April of this year, that's not that long ago, the American government was proposing that the president of South Korea be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. That's how great a man they told us he was. He was presiding over a golden age of South Korean democracy. Well, only until the other night, when he sent the army in to dismantle the parliament. The regime change operation currently underway in Georgia, which I remind you, those of you who don't know geography very well, is not in Europe, but has nonetheless, like bees to a honeypot or flies to a shit, has attracted the very same Euro parliamentarians and American parliamentarians to the streets of Tbilisi to demonstrate against the result, overwhelming result, of the Georgian elections, which, much to their chagrin, be quite a few French words this evening, elected a government that does not want war with Russia, does not want Georgia to be the new Ukraine, a government which wants peace with East and West and equidistant from both, a country which is not interested in joining the EU. Although how a country that isn't in Europe could join the EU is, of course, a very puzzling idea in the first place. But the sacking, attempted sacking of the building with fireworks and Molotov cocktails and weapons of all kinds, mainly wielded by foreigners, by the way. 1/3 of the people arrested in the riots outside the Parliament building in Tbilisi are foreigners. They are foreigners who stopped off, remarkably, as you do in Tbilisi, to engage in protest in another country about the result of that other country's election. The attacks on the Parliament building knock January 6th into a cocked hat. That was a lot of unarmed people going around in buffalo hats and Cherokee beads. That was a riot that would be a mere minor disturbance in Sochi Hall Street in Glasgow on a Saturday night, where, as it happens, I was walking last Saturday night and can testify to the veracity of that metaphor. But they're heroes for doing it outside the Parliament in Tbilisi. They were insurrectionists for doing it in Washington. Now, almost certainly Donald Trump will pardon all of them, just as well, because many of them were sentenced to years in prison for an unarmed incursion into their own country's parliament. Whereas the United States is fully behind the rioters trying to destroy the Tbilisi parliament in Georgia in exactly the way that they did in Kiev in 2014, which brought us down this miserable, blood-stained path that we have been on this last decade in the Ukraine. It's hardly surprising that sensible Georgians, and mostly they are, have no wish to go down the road that Ukraine went down. But the Ukraine war is rapidly coming to a close. You can measure that by the sense of panic in Western capitals. You can measure that by the ever more bold peace plans that are being thrown out there, showered like confetti. The latest revealed in the United States newspapers this morning. Turns out that Donald Trump's peace plan calls for the abolition of the idea of Ukraine ever joining NATO and thus being a neutral country, calls for the freezing of the conflict on the line that is reached by the time the agreement is signed, which at this rate will probably include Kiev itself. The Ukrainian armed forces are surrendering in their thousands, and they're being killed in their thousands. And the Russian armed forces are going through the Ukrainian lines like a knife through butter. Not Lurpak. I'll never eat another Lurpak. More of that later, if we've got time. The knife through butter is the Russian army, now the most formidable army on the planet. With all this experience, with all these new weapons, with all this training on the job, They better stop baiting and taunting the Russians about what their ambitions are. I personally believe they have no ambitions to recreate the Soviet Union, to deal with these provocateurs, these barking chihuahuas in the Baltic states, to try and knock some sense into Polish and German heads. I personally think they have no intention of doing any of that. But I'll tell you something, if they did, they'd be able to march all the way to Paris and probably be greeted as liberators there. So it's really time, as Colonel McGregor keeps reiterating, make peace, you fools. Make peace, you fools, before all of this ends up in a way that none of you are going to like. The Zelensky regime is now almost friendless in the world. The Speaker of the American Congress, Mike Johnson, just refused Joe Biden's demand that he send another $750 million into the chest, the war chest of Volodymyr Zelensky. The words of the Speaker, the only sane ones I've ever heard him speak, are that the United States has a new commander-in-chief just weeks away from coming into office. So, President Biden, if you don't mind, I'll not be granting you these funds until I've heard from President Trump on January the 20th. Not that that amount of money will make that much of a difference, but it's hush money that Biden is now throwing at the Ukrainian regime. He tried to write off the debt that Ukraine owes to the United States of tens of billions of dollars. Just write it off. You know why? Because that would end the possibility of the incoming President Trump's administration to go to Kiev and demand to open the books. And therein lies some of the most horrific grand larceny that you have ever heard of, read, experienced any time in your life. I believe when those books are open, they will damn the Biden administration such that no amount of pardons issued by Joe in the next few weeks are going to cut it. I believe the Biden crime family has stolen hundreds of millions of dollars from the Ukrainian people, but really from the American people, because this money was washed in the Ukraine, but they're American dollars that have been stolen. And that's why Hunter Biden's pardon has nothing to do with his gun conviction, nothing to do with his income tax conviction, and everything to do with his work in Ukraine on behalf of the big guy, who was then Vice President Joe Biden. No serious person can now dispute that. That's why Joe Biden, not since Richard Nixon's pardon given by President Gerald Ford, has there been a pardon as sweeping, far-reaching, and as timely as the one that Joe Biden issued in the dead of night last Sunday for his son, Hunter, even though he'd promised 100 times in public that he would never pardon Hunter. He didn't just pardon him. He pardoned him for any crime that he may have committed from January of 2014. Coincidentally, Hunter Biden began work as the $1 million a year oil executive at Burisma in February of 2014. That means any and all crimes, whether of corruption at the expense of the Ukrainians or corruption at the expense of the American taxpayer, throughout that entire period cannot now be prosecuted. Well, the law is an ass if that's true. But if Hunter cannot be convicted, cannot be charged, Joe can. Joe's brother can. Joe's wife can. His uncle can. His cousins can. His family business can all be prosecuted and should be. And so if President Trump ever hears of this monologue, I say this to him: you owe it not just to the American people, but to the million Ukrainians who've died to cover up Joe Biden's corruption in Ukraine, to get to the bottom of the filthy dung heap which the Democrats and Zelensky and his predecessor together have built on the dead bodies of the poor people of Ukraine. We'll be talking about Ukraine with a guest in Russia in just a few minutes. And we'll be talking in the second hour to Gerald Celente, the trends man, the man who knows where all the bodies are buried. So fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night. It is the mother of all talk shows.